Hi Year 12, this lecture's looking at processes in schools. So can you annotate onto your PowerPoint what sorts of things do you think sociologists might want to study actually within schools? Well, when it comes to processes within schools, one of the main sociological approaches you want to talk about is the interactionist approach. This is because they focus on one-to-one interactions. And as this process is all about interactions within schools, it's the best theory to use. They focus on classroom interaction and on the meanings or the motives and causes that direct that interaction. So you should be thinking about Becker, possibly some Cooley, Mead, and the relationships which develop from all of these interactions and the meanings that we place on particular symbols and behaviours. What's important to remember is that interactionists would argue that it's these interactions that have the biggest impact on how well a student does at school, not big social structures like your family or your educational background. Now, can you give an example of these sorts of interactions in schools? And there's some clues in the pictures. But it isn't just about teacher-pupil. What other interactions take place in schools that can affect educational attainment? So, when I asked you at the beginning of this lecture, what do you think sociologists might want to study in schools? These are the different areas. The taught curriculum, the hidden curriculum, teacher-pupil relationships, teacher expectations, labelling and the self-fulfilling prophecy, pupil subcultures, which I suppose is pupil-to-pupil relationships, as well as setting and streaming. And we're going to go through those in detail on the next few slides. So, the taught curriculum. What do you know about the curriculum before 1988? So how is it different to the post-1988 curriculum? You can do a bit of research online or consider some of the notes that we have on policy. So what do we know about the curriculum before 1988? How is it different to what you guys have been pretty much studying since then? And so, therefore, what is the content of the current national curriculum? So what subjects have appeared? What subjects are mandatory? How is this different to pre-1988? Now, the taught curriculum is a really important process in schools, and it's often criticised for being biased against the working class, biased against ethnic minorities and ethnocentric, and biased against females. Many feminists would argue that the taught curriculum reinforces patriarchy. Can you think of examples to highlight how the taught curriculum is biased against the working class, against ethnic minorities, and against females? Now, this mind map we're going to be doing in class together, so don't worry too much about looking at it now, but we're going to look at the hidden curriculum in a lot more detail. Now, remember, the definition of the hidden curriculum is everything you learn in school that's not on the taught curriculum, particularly the norms, values, and morals. So we're going to be examining how the different theoretical perspectives see it. We're going to be looking at some of the different research we've looked at, particularly remembering like Bowles and Gintis and what have you. But we'll do this in class. Pygmalion in the Classroom by Rosenthal and Jacobson is a great study to remember for your exam. Okay, it's based on the play. I suppose the name of the study is based on the My Fair Lady movie that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Where a professor of phonics, or the way you speak, said that he could convert a working class flower girl into a lady just by telling her she was a lady, she could be a lady, and by teaching her to speak. She was very successful and was accepted widely as a lady at the end of the film. Sorry to ruin the end of it. Therefore, she fulfilled his expectations of her, i.e. his prophecy became true. So Rosenthal and Jacobson's experiment is really, really useful because you can use it to highlight the self-fulfilling prophecy, positive expectations, labelling, and also because it's actually an experiment, it's useful for the research methods aspect of the course as well. So, can you remind yourselves of the detail of the Rosenthal and Jacobson experiment? And the key word that I always use, even though it sounds a bit rude, is the word spurter. Okay, what did they say was a spurter, or how did they identify the spurters? And what impact did this have on the students' achievement? Again, it's a great study to use because you can use it to talk about teachers' perceptions and social class, okay, which links to Becker's notion of the ideal pupil. You can also use it to talk about how teachers' perceptions and ethnicity. Now, this is where Tony Sewell argued that teachers tended to view black boys largely as troublesome, as weaker students, and as a result are more likely to possibly stereotype them negatively and give them negative labels. And you can also talk about teachers' attention and gender and the power of teacher attention and gender. Don't forget, you've got the Dale Spender, Sunderland and Spender, two different sociologists that looked at teacher attention and gender. We know that Dale Spender argued that boys benefited from extra teacher attention, but can you remind yourself of how Sunderland's study in 2000 actually criticised Dale Spender? When it comes to teacher-pupil relationships, don't forget that Becker's ideal pupil certainly fits in with the social class and the gender argument. Becker did talk about that, but you can also apply it to ethnicity as well. Like generally, the ideal pupil, in terms of teachers' expectations, is a white pupil, and to take it a step further, also possibly a Chinese pupil as well. Okay. It is worth criticising Rosenthal and Jacobson's experiment by considering, does it always happen like this? You know, is the power of positive expectations all it takes to get a student to do well? Now, you've got to think about what stuff's going on at home, what stuff's going on that's not to do with the teacher, and how that might affect achievement. It's also useful to evaluate the experiment itself. It was a relatively small sample, so it's unrepresentative. They didn't really take into account the background of their random group of spurters that they identified, so we can't tell whether some of them might have been well off and maybe not. We don't know how many of them are girls or how are boys, for example. And the ethical implications of their experiment are pretty bad because they identified this random group of students as being highly able, and as a result they received quite a lot of positive attention, so therefore they benefited from the experiment. But you've got to think about the other students in that class and how they wouldn't have benefited from the positive attention and the negative impact that would have had on their educational attainment. Labelling is a process that you guys know loads about, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We know that students may get labelled as good or problem students by both teachers and their peers. Now, this can affect their self-image and how they construct their self-image. A label can become a master status, and they can sometimes live up to it. That's a key Becker's idea. So as well as talking about the labelling theory and the self-fulfilling prophecy, he also argued that labels can become master status, and it's the only way people will see them. So in schools, for example, certain students, their master status will be, oh, they're the naughty one, they're the skivers, they're the ones who never do their homework. And as a result, a master status is way more powerful than just being labelled, because it's the only way you see yourself, and the self-fulfilling prophecy could kick in, and that's how you will behave. Alternatively, and this is always useful to AO2, Becker's idea, because he is a bit deterministic about the label, the power of the label, students can consciously set out to prove teachers wrong, okay, and reject the label. And the best study for that is Mary Fuller's study of black girls in a London school. Again, even though it's a very small study, it is worth highlighting that those girls rejected their label and proved their teacher wrong, not because they liked the teacher, but because they wanted to prove her wrong. The other process that's really important inside schools is pupil subcultures. So before I go on, can you guys define subculture? So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that pupils form subcultures that either support the values of the school, pro-school, or oppose them, anti-school subcultures. Paul Willis called them counter-school cultures. Can you annotate on your PowerPoint how these subcultures can be based on gender, how these subcultures can be based on ethnicity, and how they can be based on social class? And I've given you the different studies that talked about subcultures and gender, ethnicity, and social class. So you should be able to look back through your notes on this if you're not too sure. But what's important to know is that subcultures are possibly one of the most powerful influences on students at school. Pretty much everybody is in some form of subculture. Whether you might think of it as a friendship group, effectively that is kind of a subculture within the bigger culture of the school. And it is very important as to whether that culture is generally pro-school or anti-school. You might want to think about your own friendship group. Do you think you're in a pro or anti-school subculture? When thinking about what studies to learn, because I know there are quite a few, some of these studies you can use across a few different topics. So, for example, Paul Willis's study focused on white working class boys. So effectively, you could use his study to talk about social class, talk about gender, and to talk about ethnicity, because we know that white working class boys are still today some of the lowest achieving groups in schools. You've also got Martin Mackingale, who talked about macho subcultures being formed around male working class boys linked to changes in the economy. And Becky Francis looked at working class boys and how they see success as feminine. So again, for gender and social class. Likewise, Tony Sewell is a really good one to remember, particularly because he talks about black boys forming anti-school subcultures, in terms of responding to negative stereotypes of teachers, and you can use that for gender and ethnicity. We've also got Debbie Epstein, looked a bit more detail at black boys. Mackingale, again, we talked about already, and Gilburn, his research looked at how boys sort of respond, I suppose, to institutional racism in schools and end up forming subcultures. When thinking about Mackingale's study, you might want to think about how the Black Sisters sort of rejected, to an extent, the ethnocentric curriculum, and it kind of bound them together. And you've got Mary Fuller's study as well, a female Afro-Caribbean subculture that rejected their negative labels. Now, when it comes to setting and streaming, I'd like you to do a little bit of research on arguments in favour of mixed ability and the effect that it has on achievement, and the arguments for setting and streaming, where you put people into groups according to their ability, and the impact this has. We are going to be doing something in class, but I want you to bring your own research about the debate around mixed ability groups, or having everyone in a different set or a different stream depending on their ability. The study that you might want to consider when thinking about setting and streaming is Stephen Ball's study, because he found in a comprehensive school where they got rid of sets, anti-school subcultures disappeared. However, the underachievement still continued. Now, can you remember what he blamed the underachievement on? So at this point, I'd just like to have a quick think about what impact do the following have on students' achievement in schools. And you can talk about gender, class, and ethnicity. So you've got the hidden curriculum, subcultures, setting and streaming, and teacher-pupil relationships. One of the questions we're going to be talking about in class is, which process do you think influences achievement the most, and why? So of those four, which do you think influences achievement the most and why? And you need to back that up with evidence. Over the next few slides, I've simply highlighted the different studies that have talked about processes within schools. This slide's talking about how the processes within schools have affected social class, and I'm not going to read through it all with you. I want you to add your notes onto your PowerPoint, but I will nudge this one up a little bit. So the bottom of the Bowles and Gintis one's been cut out, but I'm fairly certain you all know what Bowles and Gintis argued there was a correspondence between where and where, so I'm sure you can annotate that on yourself. This is all the different studies about processes within schools that affect ethnicity or different ethnic groups. Again, at the very bottom, they've cut it off, which is not very helpful. That's the argument about David Gilburn, who argued that white teachers tended to see characteristics of black culture as rule breaking. So, for example, many black boys might be criticised for the way they walk, or sometimes even the way they sit, or the way they dress, or sometimes even the way they speak. So as a result, they actually would end up being behaviour managed simply for acting in what was normal for their cultural heritage. So it's an argument that the hidden curriculum itself was ethnocentric, I suppose. So yeah, please add your notes in about those different studies. And here we are, the studies that look at processes that affect gender. And if you want to do some extra research, you can look in your textbooks. Okay, I've given you the page numbers there as well. And this is the 12-mark question that we're going to be looking at working on together in class when I next see you. Thanks, Year 12.